Year 11, I'm just going to go over some stuff about the America unit that we did last term, helping you for the mock and also for your real GCSEs, and obviously those in Year 10, when you get into Year 11 next year, you can have a look at that. So we're going to start looking at the Supreme Court. So America has got a separation of powers. So it's got a judicial branch, it's got an executive branch, and it's got a legislative branch. And to understand why things happen, not just in civil rights, but in all sorts of other things, you've got to understand how those systems work. And for some people in Year 11, that's quite a tough ask because it's more political than history. So we've seen on the Supreme Court a number of things that they've done, particularly Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 to do with the desegregation of buses in Montgomery, Alabama. We also saw in 1955, the Brown versus Board of Education to do with education, and then we saw Browder versus Gale in 1955 to do with Montgomery, Alabama. We also saw Boyden versus Virginia in 1960, which was about desegregating interstate buses. So Brown versus Board of Education is about schools. Browder versus Gale is about buses in Montgomery, Alabama, and then the other one I talked about before is about interstate, Boyden versus Virginia in 1960. So what you can see here is that the court makes a big effort to change civil rights in America. But we also need to look at the executive branch as well, which is the president, because the president plays a big role in changing civil rights and other stuff as well. So we've seen in 1957, in Little Rock, Eisenhower intervening. We've also seen in 1961, in the James Meredith case, we've seen Kennedy intervening to help and change civil rights. And we've also seen the way that these branches work together. So the president needs the legislative branch to pass legislation. Now we know that's difficult because we saw that in 1957 in the first Civil Rights Act, which was quite weak and only really changed the voting up to about 3% of more black people voting. But in the 1960s, we see the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we see the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we can see the interplay between President and Congress. Now, what you've got to ask yourself is not only what are these branches doing? This is called the federal government. So the federal government isn't just the president, it isn't just the Supreme Court, it's also the legislative branch. Now, what you've got to ask yourself is, does the federal government play a bigger role in changing the situation, or are there other factors that interplay? So, for example, would the Supreme Court have passed Brown versus Board of Education to peak if it wasn't for the NAACP, the National Association of Advancement of Coloured People? Would we have got Browder versus Gale in 1955 without the Montgomery bus boycott, for example? Would we have got changes at Little Rock in 1957 had it been not for the incredible bravery of the Little Rock Nine? Would we have got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 65 without the whole stuff that we've talked about the role of Martin Luther King and the way in which the pressure was there? Maybe that's the March on Washington you could write about. Maybe it was other factors that wasn't to do with Martin Luther King, like the March on Birmingham. And you can even, in these sorts of questions, bring in other areas that are not maybe to do with King. Maybe some of the governors. Maybe some of the governors in terms of Arkansas, and maybe some of the police chief in terms of Bull Connor in Birmingham in 1963, and the way that he actually facilitated that. Now, you've also got other things that you might want to think about when you're looking at the different branches, and that's not just the civil rights. That could be the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade in the women's movement in terms of abortion. That could be the legislative branch in terms of all sorts of things that now got, such as the Equal Pay Act. So And also, you want to be thinking about the role of presidents in changing the women's movement. You could also think about things like the Vietnam War and the role of presidents like LBJ and Nixon in terms of his Vietnamization policy. So for the whole of the American section, perhaps even on the student, you could look at some of the students' involvement in terms of change coming from these different branches in terms of the lives of students. So it's really important that when you're studying the American system, not just the Civil Rights Act, but students and women and the Vietnam War movement, that you understand what the federal government is. So the federal government is not just the president, it's not just the Supreme Court, and it's not just the legislative branch. And the big question you've got to ask yourself is, does change happen because presidents want to push it, or the Supreme Court want to change the Constitution, or legislation is introduced into Congress? Or does change happen because there's pressure? And that's up to you to think about. Would civil rights have been passed without Martin Luther King? Would the women's movement have achieved what they achieved without Betty Friedan? Or is the actual federal government pushing for change?